There was a cobbler in occupied Prague who held more secrets in his hands than the entire Nazi intelligence network ever suspected. While SS officers clicked their polished boots through the ancient streets of the Czech capital, they had no idea that the very heels supporting their arrogance were hollow chambers, carrying the blueprints of their own destruction. Henrik Vogel was not a soldier, not a spy in any traditional sense, but his worn fingers stitched together one of the most ingenious espionage operations of World War II. The question that haunts historians to this day is simple yet terrifying. How many classified documents walked out of Wehrmacht headquarters on the feet of the men who were supposed to protect them? By the time you finish this story, you'll understand why a humble shoe repair shop became ground zero for one of the war's most audacious intelligence coups, and why the Gestapo spent years searching for a ghost who was hiding in plain sight, hammer in hand, measuring the feet of the very men hunting him. The year was 1942, and Prague had become a city of whispers and shadows. The Nazi occupation had transformed the golden spires and cobblestone streets into a surveillance state where trust was a currency more valuable than food. The Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia existed as a puppet state under Reinhard Heydrich's iron grip, and every corner of Czech life had been infiltrated, monitored and controlled. In this suffocating atmosphere, where speaking Czech too loudly could mean arrest, and where Jewish neighbors disappeared in the night, the population had learned to survive through silence and submission. But beneath this forced quietude, a resistance network was forming, one that understood a fundamental truth about warfare. Information is the sharpest weapon. The challenge was not just gathering intelligence, but moving it out of occupied territory without triggering the elaborate security apparatus the Nazis had constructed. Traditional methods of espionage had become suicide missions, and the resistance needed something the Germans would never anticipate. Henrik Vogel had inherited his father's cobbler shop on a narrow street in the Malá Strana district, just a 10-minute walk from Prague Castle, where the Nazi administration had established its headquarters. The shop had served Prague's citizens for 3 generations, and its reputation for quality craftsmanship had survived the occupation intact. What made Vogel's establishment particularly valuable to the Nazi officers was simple. He was the best bootmaker in the city, and these men were vain about their appearance. A well-fitted boot was not just footwear, but a symbol of authority, a statement of superiority over the conquered population. Officers would wait weeks for an appointment with Vogel, trusting his skilled hands to create boots that would last through the brutal Eastern Front winters or shine perfectly during parades through subjugated capitals. They saw him as a useful tradesman, nothing more, a Czech who had accepted his place in the new order. They measured him by his deference, his quiet efficiency, his ability to never meet their eyes directly when they spoke. What these officers failed to notice was that Henrik Vogel measured them right back. Every fitting became an intelligence-gathering session, every casual conversation a potential leak of operational information. Officers relaxed in his shop, treating him as invisible, discussing troop movements and supply problems as if he were a piece of furniture. But Vogel's mind was a steel trap, cataloguing everything, forgetting nothing. He had been approached by the Czech resistance in the spring of 1942, not long after Heydrich had intensified his campaign of terror against the population. The resistance had a critical problem. They were receiving valuable intelligence from sympathetic sources within the Nazi administration, secretaries and clerks who risked everything to photograph documents. But getting those microfilm documents out of Prague to Allied intelligence in London was nearly impossible. Checkpoints ringed the city, informants lurked everywhere, and anyone caught with sensitive materials faced immediate execution along with their entire family. The resistance needed a courier system that was invisible, and one of their operatives had a radical idea. What if the Nazis themselves carried the intelligence out? What if the very symbols of their occupation became the vessels of their own defeat? When they approached Vogel with the concept, he understood immediately that his unique position made him the only person who could execute such a plan. He had access to Nazi boots, he had the technical skill to modify them without detection, and most importantly, he had the nerve. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Vogel would create false heels in the boots of officers being transferred to other posts, particularly those heading west toward France or south toward Italy, routes that would eventually allow the microfilms to reach Allied territory. The hollow compartments would be sealed so perfectly that even a thorough inspection would reveal nothing, and the officer wearing them would have no idea he was transporting the Reich's secrets with every step. For this to work, Vogel would need to transform himself into an artist of deception. Every boot that left his shop would need to be absolutely perfect, beyond suspicion, a masterpiece of craftsmanship that would never prompt a second look. He would need to memorize which officers were scheduled for transfer, identify the right targets, and time the insertions of microfilm with surgical precision. One mistake, one loose heel, one officer who decided to have his boots resoled by a different cobbler in another city, and the entire network would collapse. The Gestapo would trace everything back to his shop within hours, and Henrik Vogel would die screaming in a basement cell in Czech Palace, the notorious interrogation center where resistance fighters went to have their secrets extracted along with their fingernails. But he had made his choice, and there was no turning back. The transformation of Henrik Vogel's shop into a spy hub began with the smallest of modifications, changes so subtle that even his own apprentice failed to notice them at first. Vogel had always kept his workshop meticulously organized, with leather hides sorted by quality and tools arranged with obsessive precision, but now he introduced a new system that only he understood. Certain boots would be marked with nearly invisible chalk symbols on their inner soles, codes that told him which pairs were destined for modification and which were simply ordinary repairs for ordinary customers. He constructed a false bottom in one of his storage cabinets where resistance operatives could leave microfilm canisters no larger than a pencil eraser, each one containing up to 60 frames of photographed documents. The exchange would happen during business hours, hidden within the flow of normal customers. A resistant member posing as someone picking up repaired shoes while actually delivering the precious cargo. The timing had to be perfect because Vogel never knew when a Gestapo informant might be watching his shop, counting his customers, noting any suspicious patterns. The technical challenge of creating undetectable hollow heels pushed Vogel's craftsmanship to its absolute limits. Traditional boot heels were constructed from layers of leather stacked and compressed, then shaped and finished to provide both durability and comfort. Vogel's modified heels needed to maintain that exact appearance and feel while concealing a cavity large enough to hold a microfilm canister. He developed a technique where he would carefully separate the heel layers, carve out a precise cylindrical chamber using tools he had sharpened specifically for this purpose, then insert the canister wrapped in wax paper to prevent any rattling. The reassembly required perfect adhesion and compression so that the weight and sound of the boot remained identical to an unmodified pair. He tested each modification obsessively, walking around his workshop in the boots himself, listening for any sound that might betray the secret, feeling for any irregularity in balance that an officer might notice. A Nazi officer lived in his boots, marched in them for hours, and would immediately sense if something felt wrong. What made Vogel's position uniquely dangerous was that he could not simply modify any boot that came through his door. The resistance provided him with target lists, names of officers scheduled for transfers to locations where the microfilms could potentially reach Allied intelligence networks. An SS captain being reassigned to Paris was a perfect candidate because the French resistance had established reliable channels to London. A Wehrmacht colonel heading to Vienna was useless because Austria was firmly under Nazi control with no viable extraction routes. Vogel had to match the intelligence timeline with the boot repair schedule, sometimes holding microfilms for weeks, waiting for the right pair of boots to arrive, all while knowing that discovery meant death. He lived with the constant fear that an officer might cancel a repair appointment, or worse, that someone would be reassigned before collecting their modified boots, leaving Vogel stuck with incriminating evidence he could not easily dispose of without raising suspicion. The psychological toll of this double life began to manifest in ways Vogel struggled to control. Every knock on his shop door sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. Every unexpected visit from a Nazi officer made his hands tremble slightly as he measured their feet. He developed a ritual of methodical breathing before opening each morning, preparing his face to show nothing but humble servitude, regardless of what walked through that door. Sleep became fragmented and haunted by nightmares of discovery, visions of Gestapo agents tearing apart his shop while he stood helpless, watching them find the hidden microfilms. He could confide in no one, not even his elderly mother who lived above the shop, because the Nazis had perfected the art of extracting information through family torture. His isolation was complete, a solitary warrior fighting a secret war with leather and thread, and the weight of it pressed down on him with every breath. Yet despite the terror, despite the sleepless nights and the constant surveillance, Henrik Vogel continued his work with an almost mechanical precision. He had become something more than a cobbler and something different than a traditional spy. He was a contradiction wrapped in deference, a ghost operating in full view of his enemies, and with every pair of boots that left his shop carrying secrets in their heels, he was changing the course of the war one step at a time. The question was not whether he would be caught, but how long he could maintain this impossible charade before his luck, his nerves, or his circumstances finally betrayed him. The first test of Vogel's system came in late summer of 1942, when a Sturmbannführer named Klaus Richter arrived at the shop for a complete boot fitting. Richter was exactly the type of officer the resistance had been waiting for, a mid-level SS administrator being transferred to occupied France to oversee logistics operations in Lyon. The resistance had provided Vogel with Richter's name 3 days earlier, along with a microfilm canister containing photographed documents about upcoming deportation schedules from Prague to concentration camps in Poland. The intelligence was time-sensitive and critical, information that could save lives if it reached the right hands in London, but it also meant Vogel had no margin for error. He would get one chance to complete the modification, and if Richter noticed anything unusual about his new boots, the entire operation would end before it truly began. Vogel spent the night before the appointment unable to sleep, running through every step of the process in his mind, visualizing each cut, each layer, each moment of assembly, until his hands knew the movements by pure muscle memory. Richter arrived precisely on time, as German officers always did, his presence filling the small shop with an oppressive authority that made the air feel heavier. He was a tall man with cold grey eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they touched, and he spoke to Vogel with the casual dismissiveness reserved for conquered peoples. The fitting took nearly an hour, with Richter demanding specific measurements and expressing particular concerns about arch support for long periods of standing during inspections. Vogel played his role perfectly, nodding deferentially, taking meticulous notes, assuring the officer that his boots would be the finest he had ever worn. What Richter could not see was that Vogel was also memorizing the exact dimensions of his feet, calculating precisely how much space he could carve from the heels without compromising structural integrity or comfort. The Sturmbannführer left the shop satisfied, expecting his boots to be ready for pickup in 10 days, completely unaware that he had just commissioned the instrument of his own intelligence defeat. The actual modification took Vogel 6 hours of uninterrupted work, performed late at night, after he had closed and locked the shop. He worked by candlelight rather than electric light, a precaution against nosy neighbors who might wonder why the cobbler was working so late. Every cut into the heel layers had to be surgically precise, creating a cylindrical chamber exactly 13 millimeters in diameter and 25 millimeters deep, dimensions that matched the microfilm canister perfectly. He carved slowly, testing the structural integrity after each layer was removed, ensuring that the remaining material could still support the weight and stress of military marching. The microfilm canister slid into place like a bullet into a chamber, wrapped in thin wax paper and sealed with a specialized adhesive that Vogel had acquired through resistance channels. He then reassembled the heel with such precision that even under magnification, the seam would appear to be nothing more than the natural layering of quality leather construction. The final step was the most nerve-wracking, a process Vogel called the sound test. He put on the completed boots himself and walked slowly around his workshop, listening with the concentration of a safecracker for any click, any rattle, any acoustic signature that might betray the hidden compartment. He walked on wood floors, on stone, on the metal grating near his workbench, testing every surface type that Richter might encounter. He jumped slightly, simulating the impact of stepping off a curb or climbing stairs. He twisted his feet, replicating the stress of turning sharply during military formations. The boots remained silent, their secret locked away in engineered perfection. Only then did Vogel allow himself a moment of relief, though he knew the real test would come when Richter returned to claim them and wore them out of the shop for the first time. When Sturmbannführer Richter arrived for pickup 9 days later, Vogel's heart hammered so violently he feared the officer might hear it across the counter. Richter tried on the boots, walking around the shop with measured steps, testing their fit and comfort. He bent his knees, rose on his toes, examined the stitching with the critical eye of a man accustomed to military precision. Vogel watched every micro-expression on the German's face, searching for any hint of suspicion, any suggestion that something felt wrong. After what seemed like an eternity, but was actually less than 5 minutes, Richter nodded with satisfaction, paid for the boots without comment and walked out of the shop wearing them. Vogel waited until the officer disappeared around the corner before his knees nearly buckled. The first package had been delivered, and somewhere in the hollow heel of those perfectly crafted boots, information that could save hundreds of lives was now walking toward France, carried by the enemy himself. The success of the Richter operation transformed Henrik Vogel from a tentative conspirator into a vital node in the Czech resistance network, and within weeks, the demand for his services expanded beyond anything he had anticipated. The resistance began feeding him a steady stream of target names, sometimes 2 or 3 officers per week, each one representing a potential courier for intelligence flowing out of occupied Prague. The microfilms themselves contained an astonishing variety of classified material, everything from troop deployment orders and supply chain logistics to architectural plans of fortifications and even intercepted communications between Nazi commanders. Vogel never asked what was on the films, and the resistance never told him, maintaining operational security through compartmentalization. But he understood that every canister he concealed represented weeks or months of dangerous work by other operatives who had risked everything to photograph those documents. His workshop became a critical junction point where human courage was transformed into hollow heels and sent marching toward Allied intelligence networks across occupied Europe. The technical demands of the operation forced Vogel to develop increasingly sophisticated methods for creating his hidden compartments. Not all boots were created equal, and different styles required different approaches to modification. Officer dress boots with their taller heels offered more space and were easier to work with, but they were also less commonly worn for travel, making them poor choices for long-distance intelligence transport. Field boots presented the opposite challenge, with their shorter, more robust heels that had to withstand harsh conditions but offered less room for concealment. Vogel learned to assess each pair individually, sometimes spending hours studying their construction before deciding whether they could safely accommodate a microfilm canister. He developed a mental catalogue of boot manufacturers and their construction techniques, knowing that boots made by certain factories in Germany used laminated heels that were nearly impossible to modify without visible damage, while others used compression techniques that gave him just enough flexibility to work his magic. This expertise made him irreplaceable because no one else in the resistance network possessed both the technical skill and the access to modify Nazi officer footwear without detection. The psychological burden of maintaining his cover identity grew heavier with each successful operation. Vogel had to be charming and deferential to the very men whose regime was destroying his country, smiling at their jokes, thanking them for their patronage, treating them with a respect that made his stomach turn. Some of the officers were simply bureaucrats doing a job, unremarkable men who happened to wear a swastika, but others were true believers who spoke casually about the inferiority of Slavic peoples while Vogel measured their feet and nodded along. He listened to them brag about efficiency improvements in deportation scheduling, heard them complain about the difficulties of managing occupied populations, watched them flip through photographs of their families while his own people were being loaded into cattle cars. The cognitive dissonance of crafting perfect boots for these men while simultaneously sabotaging them required Vogel to split himself into 2 people, the obsequious Cobbler who existed in their presence and the resistance operative who emerged only in the privacy of his locked workshop at night. The operational tempo increased dramatically in early 1943 as the war situation shifted and the Nazi administration began rotating more officers through Prague. The city had become a strategic hub for coordinating operations across Central Europe, which meant a constant flow of military personnel being reassigned to various theaters of war. For the resistance, this represented a golden opportunity, because officers traveling to places like France, Italy, or even Norway could potentially serve as unwitting couriers to locations where Allied intelligence networks were active. Vogel found himself working nearly every night, sometimes modifying multiple pairs of boots simultaneously, his workshop transformed into a clandestine production line of espionage. He developed a system of careful record-keeping using innocuous notations in his account ledger, marks that looked like simple inventory codes but actually tracked which boots had been modified when they were picked up and where the officers were supposedly being transferred. This information allowed the resistance to coordinate with their contacts in other countries, alerting them to watch for specific officers whose boots carried precious cargo. But success bred complacency, and Vogel began to notice small signs that made his instincts scream warnings he tried desperately to ignore. Certain customers started asking unusual questions about his techniques, wanting to know details about heel construction that seemed excessive for simple curiosity. An officer he had never seen before came in requesting repairs on boots that showed almost no wear, as if they had been purchased specifically to be brought to his shop. The Gestapo had informants everywhere, and Vogel knew that the longer his operation continued, the higher the probability that some pattern would emerge, some anomaly would be noticed, some coincidence would seem too convenient to be chance. He was walking a tightrope stretched across an abyss, and every successful operation brought him one step closer to the moment when the rope would finally snap beneath his feet. The turning point came in March of 1943, when a Gestapo officer named Ernst Kaufmann walked into Vogel's shop without an appointment, carrying a pair of badly scuffed boots that he claimed needed immediate repair. Something about Kaufmann set off every alarm in Vogel's nervous system, a predatory awareness in the man's eyes that suggested he saw more than he pretended to see. Kaufmann was not like the vain officers who came for custom fittings or the busy administrators who dropped off boots and picked them up without conversation. He lingered in the shop, asking questions about Vogel's clientele, commenting on how busy the Cobbler must be with so many high-ranking officers as customers, noting with false casualness how many of those officers seemed to be getting transferred lately. Vogel maintained his humble demeanor, responding with carefully neutral answers, but his mind was racing through possibilities. Was this a fishing expedition, or did Kaufmann already have evidence? Had someone been arrested and given up information under torture? Was the entire network compromised, or was this simply routine Gestapo paranoia, the kind of random check that could destroy an innocent life just as easily as expose a guilty one? The resistance had prepared Vogel for this scenario with specific protocols designed to protect the network if any individual member aim under suspicion. He was supposed to cease all operations immediately, make no contact with other resistance members, and wait for an all-clear signal that might never come. But Vogel faced an impossible dilemma, because sitting in his workshop at that very moment were 3 pairs of boots in various stages of modification, one of them already containing a microfilm canister that documented Nazi plans for a massive deportation operation scheduled for the following week. If he abandoned those boots unfinished, the intelligence would die with them, and hundreds of lives that might have been saved would be lost. If he completed the modifications, and Kaufmann was indeed investigating him, he would be caught with irrefutable evidence of espionage. The choice was paralyzed by fear or risk, everything on the possibility that Kaufmann was simply a suspicious man conducting a routine intimidation visit, the kind of random terror the Gestapo used to keep the occupied population compliant. Vogel made his decision based on a calculation that was equal parts courage and desperation. He would complete the modifications, but implement emergency protocols that would give him plausible deniability if discovered. He spent the next 2 nights working with a speed that sacrificed some of his usual perfectionism, creating compartments that were functional but could potentially be explained as structural repairs if examined. He prepared a cover story about experimental heel reinforcement techniques he was testing for durability. Complete with partially modified practice boots, he deliberately left visible in his workshop as false evidence. The resistance had taught him that the best lies were built on frameworks of truth, and if the Gestapo came for him, he would claim he was simply innovating his craft, unaware that anyone might have tampered with the boots after they left his shop. It was a thin story that would never survive serious interrogation, but it might buy him enough time to warn others in the network before he broke under torture. The paranoia that gripped Vogel during this period became almost unbearable, transforming every shadow into a threat and every sound into the footsteps of his executioners. He began noticing the same faces on his street at different times of day, men who seemed to have no purpose beyond standing and watching. A car parked across from his shop for 3 consecutive days, its occupants occasionally changing, but their attention always focused on his door. He spotted someone photographing his storefront from a distance, the camera poorly concealed beneath a coat. These could have been legitimate surveillance operations, or they could have been figments of an imagination stretched to its breaking point by stress and fear. The human mind under sustained pressure begins to see patterns everywhere, to interpret randomness as conspiracy, and Vogel was no longer certain whether he was being genuinely watched or whether his guilt was manufacturing phantoms. Either way, the effect was the same. He was slowly being crushed by the weight of his double life. Then, on a cold morning in late March, Vogel arrived at his shop to find the door already unlocked, though he distinctly remembered securing it the previous evening. His stomach dropped as he pushed the door open, expecting to find Gestapo agents waiting inside, but the shop was empty. Nothing appeared disturbed at first glance, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he noticed subtle signs of intrusion. Tools were slightly out of position. Drawers had been opened and not quite closed to their original positions, and most tellingly, the false-bottomed cabinet where microfilms were exchanged had visible scratches around its edges, as if someone had tested whether it might contain a hidden compartment, but had not quite found the release mechanism. Someone had searched his shop professionally and carefully, looking for evidence, but not yet finding enough to justify an arrest. Vogel stood frozen in his own workshop, understanding with terrible clarity that the hunt was on, and he was the prey. The discovery of the search forced Vogel into an immediate crisis decision that would define the rest of his war and potentially the rest of his life. He had approximately 3 pairs of modified boots waiting for pickup by officers scheduled to depart Prague within the next week, and abandoning them would mean sacrificing vital intelligence while simultaneously leaving physical evidence of his espionage activities sitting in his workshop like ticking time bombs. The resistance protocols were clear. When compromise seemed imminent, operatives were supposed to destroy all evidence and disappear into hiding, but Vogel understood that disappearing would immediately confirm Gestapo suspicions and trigger a manhunt that would endanger everyone he had ever worked with. His only chance was to continue operating as if nothing had changed, to maintain his cover so perfectly that the searchers would begin to doubt their own suspicions, all while secretly accelerating the delivery of the remaining modified boots, and then finding a way to gracefully exit the operation before the trap finally closed. The psychological toll of maintaining normalcy, while knowing he was likely under active surveillance, pushed Vogel into a state of hyper-awareness that bordered on dissociation. He opened his shop each morning with hands that wanted to tremble but were forced into steadiness through sheer willpower. When customers arrived, he engaged in the same pleasant small talk he had always offered, discussing weather and leather quality and the challenges of keeping boots maintained during muddy spring conditions, all while his peripheral vision constantly scanned for watchers, for unusual questions, for any sign that this customer might actually be an interrogator in disguise. He developed the ability to split his consciousness, one part performing the familiar routines of his trade, while another part remained hyper-vigilant, analyzing every detail for threat signatures. Sleep became impossible, replaced by a kind of waking unconsciousness, where he would lie in bed with his eyes closed, but his mind racing through contingency plans and escape scenarios that he knew were probably futile, but couldn't stop constructing. The 3 officers who arrived over the following days to collect their modified boots represented three separate gambles with Vogel's life. The first was a Wehrmacht logistics captain heading to northern Italy, a straightforward case that proceeded without incident. The second was an SS intelligence officer being reassigned to Paris, a man whose professional paranoia made him examine the boots with unsettling thoroughness before finally accepting them with a curt nod. The third was the most dangerous, a Gestapo administrator named Henrik Vogel, who was transferring to Lyon and whose boots contained microfilm detailing the organizational structure of the entire Prague Gestapo office. Vogel had argued against this particular operation, understanding that if Vogel discovered the compartment, the intelligence would directly lead back to sources within the Gestapo itself, triggering an internal purge that would be absolutely brutal. But the resistance had insisted the intelligence was too valuable to pass up, and Vogel had reluctantly completed the modification, while knowing it might be the decision that finally destroyed them all. Wold's pickup appointment fell on a Thursday afternoon, and Vogel spent the preceding night in a state of near catatonic dread. He had crafted Wold's boots with obsessive precision, testing them more thoroughly than any previous pair, but he also knew that Wold was a professional investigator whose job was to find things people wanted hidden. When Wold arrived, he was accompanied by a subordinate, a young Gestapo officer who stood by the door with his hand resting casually on his sidearm holster. The subordinate's presence could have been routine security protocol, or it could have been the setup for an arrest, and Vogel would not know which until Wold either walked out with the boots or signaled for his colleague to draw his weapon. Wold tried on the boots with methodical slowness, testing their fit, examining their construction, commenting on the quality of the leather and the precision of the stitching. Then he stood and walked in small circles around the shop, and Vogel could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears like artillery fire. Finally, after an eternity compressed into 5 minutes, Wold nodded his approval, paid, and left with his subordinate, the hollow heels of his boots clicking against the cobblestones as he walked away carrying the secrets of his own organization toward France. After Wold's departure, Vogel sat alone in his workshop for nearly an hour, unable to move, his body finally releasing the accumulated tension of months of sustained terror. He had successfully delivered dozens of modified boots carrying intelligence across occupied Europe, information that had undoubtedly saved lives and damaged Nazi operations in ways he would never know or be able to measure. But he also understood with absolute certainty that his operational usefulness was ending. The Gestapo investigation might have gone quiet, but it had not disappeared, and every additional operation increased the probability of discovery. The resistance needed to find a way to extract him from Prague before the inevitable arrest came, but extraction operations were extraordinarily dangerous and low priority compared to other resistance activities. Vogel was trapped in a city that had become his prison, waiting for either rescue or capture, knowing that both options carried the strong possibility of death. The final act of Henrik Vogel's espionage career began not with a planned operation, but with an unexpected opportunity that arrived in the form of Oberführer Hans Dietrich, one of the highest-ranking SS officers in the Prague administration. Dietrich was being promoted and transferred to Berlin itself, to a position within the Reich Main Security Office, where he would have access to strategic planning at the highest levels of Nazi command. The resistance received this information through their sources and immediately recognized the explosive potential. A courier with direct access to the heart of the Nazi war machine, someone whose travel between Prague and Berlin would be routine and completely above suspicion. But Dietrich was also notoriously paranoid and detail-oriented, a man who personally inspected everything from his meals to his uniforms for signs of tampering or poisoning. Modifying his boots would be the most dangerous operation Vogel had ever attempted, and the resistance made it clear that this would be his last mission regardless of outcome. If he succeeded, they would activate an extraction plan to get him out of Prague. If he failed, he would be on his own. The microfilm canister designated for Dietrich's boots contained something unprecedented: comprehensive intelligence about Nazi communication security, including code procedures and encryption methodologies that Allied codebreakers desperately needed. The information had been compiled over months by a resistance cell operating within the German Signals Intelligence Office, and getting it to Allied hands could potentially accelerate the breaking of crucial Nazi communications by months or even years. The stakes were so high that the resistance was willing to risk their most valuable operative to deliver it, and Vogel understood that refusing this mission was not truly an option. He had been preparing for this moment since the day Kaufmann first walked into his shop, knowing that eventually the resistance would ask him to attempt something so audacious that success seemed impossible. Dietrich represented that moment, the culmination of everything Vogel had learned, every technique he had perfected, every fear he had learned to suppress in the service of something larger than his own survival. Dietrich's appointment was scheduled for a Friday morning, and he arrived with 2 bodyguards who remained stationed outside the shop while the Oberfuhrer came in alone. Dietrich was a compact man with the bearing of someone who had spent decades commanding absolute obedience, and his eyes held the flat effect of a person who had witnessed or ordered so much violence that human suffering no longer registered as remarkable. He wanted boots that would be appropriate for Berlin headquarters, impressive enough to reflect his new status, but practical enough for the long hours he anticipated working. Vogel took measurements with hands that he forced into steadiness, making careful notes about Dietrich's preferences for heel height and leather finish, all while calculating whether he could create a hollow compartment deep enough for the canister without compromising the boot's structure. The technical challenge was enormous because Dietrich had specifically requested reinforced heels for durability, which meant less material to work with and a higher probability that any modification would be detectable. The fabrication of Dietrich's boots consumed Vogel completely for the next 8 days. He worked with a focus that bordered on obsession, understanding that this pair had to transcend mere competence and achieve absolute perfection. Every stitch had to be flawless, every curve of leather had to flow naturally, every aspect of construction had to be so precisely executed that even microscopic examination would reveal only masterful craftsmanship. The hollow compartment required him to develop an entirely new technique, one that involved creating a false heel within the actual heel, a nested construction so subtle that the weight distribution would remain absolutely natural. He carved the chamber with tools he had sharpened to surgical precision, working by candlelight in the dead of night, his aging eyes straining to see details that would determine whether he lived or died. The microfilm canister fit with less than a millimeter of tolerance on any side, and sealing it required an adhesive application so perfect that the seam would be invisible even under magnification. When he finally completed the boots 4 days before the scheduled pickup, Vogel subjected them to the most rigorous testing he had ever conducted, wearing them himself for hours, walking on every surface type he could find, listening with desperate intensity for any acoustic signature that might betray their secret. The night before Dietrich's pickup appointment, Vogel received an unexpected visitor through the back entrance of his shop. It was a young woman he recognized as a courier for the resistance, someone he had seen perhaps twice before in passing. She carried a message that had been passed through 3 intermediaries to avoid direct communication. If the Dietrich operation succeeded, Vogel was to close his shop exactly 1 week later, claiming illness, and a truck would arrive at midnight to begin his extraction from Prague. The route would take him south through the mountains into the Protectorate's rural areas, then eventually across the border into Hungary, where the resistance had connections. It was a dangerous plan with a low probability of success, but it represented his only realistic chance of survival. The courier left as silently as she had arrived, and Vogel spent the remaining hours before dawn sitting in his workshop, surrounded by the tools of his trade, understanding that regardless of what happened when Dietrich returned, his life as Henrik Vogel the Cobbler was already over. Oberfuhrer Dietrich arrived precisely at 1000 hours on the appointed day, his staff car pulling up directly in front of the shop with an arrogance that blocked half the narrow street. Vogel watched through his window as Dietrich emerged, flanked again by his bodyguards, their presence a reminder that this man wielded the power of life and death over everyone in Prague. The moment Dietrich crossed the threshold, Vogel felt time compress into a crystalline clarity where every detail became hyper-real. He could see the individual threads in Dietrich's uniform, smell the pomade in his hair, hear the precise cadence of his boots against the wooden floor. The Oberfuhrer's expression revealed nothing, no warmth, no anticipation, just the flat expectation of receiving exactly what he had paid for. Vogel presented the boots with a deference that had been refined through hundreds of similar interactions, but this time his entire future hung on the next few minutes. One wrong detail, one unexpected question, one moment of suspicion, and everything would end in that small shop surrounded by leather and tools. Dietrich examined the boots with an intensity that justified every hour Vogel had spent perfecting them. He turned them over slowly, studying the stitching patterns, running his fingers along the seams, testing the flexibility of the leather, checking the alignment of the heels. He held them up to the light streaming through the shop window, looking for inconsistencies in the finish. He even removed one of his current boots and compared the heel construction directly, a move that sent Vogel's heart rate into a dangerous acceleration that he desperately fought to control. The Oberfuhrer asked questions about the specific type of leather used, the source of the materials, the expected durability under various conditions. Vogel answered each question with the detailed knowledge of a master craftsman, providing information that was both accurate and sufficiently technical to satisfy Dietrich's paranoid need for verification. After what felt like an eternity, but was actually about 8 minutes, Dietrich sat down and allowed Vogel to help him into the boots, the standard ritual of a fitting that now carried the weight of life and death. Dietrich stood and began walking around the shop, testing the boots with methodical precision. He walked normally, then quickly, then slowly. He shifted his weight from heel to toe, testing the balance. He turned sharply, simulating military pivots. He even performed a few small jumps, checking for structural integrity under stress. Vogel maintained his professional demeanor, offering observations about break-in time and leather softening, but internally he was monitoring every micro-expression on Dietrich's face, searching for any hint that something felt wrong. The Oberfuhrer's face remained a mask of concentration, revealing nothing. Then, just when Vogel thought the ordeal might be ending, Dietrich stopped walking and stood completely still, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something. The silence in the shop became absolute, broken only by the distant sound of a truck passing on a nearby street. Vogel felt his blood turn to ice as he watched Dietrich shift his weight again, clearly testing for a sound or sensation that had caught his attention. The moment stretched into unbearable tension as Dietrich continued his motionless listening posture. Vogel's mind raced through possible explanations he could offer if questioned, but he knew that any defensive statement before an accusation would itself be suspicious. He forced himself to remain silent, to appear merely professionally attentive rather than terrified, to breathe normally despite the adrenaline screaming through his system. Finally, after what might have been 20 seconds but felt like 20 years, Dietrich resumed walking, completed 2 more circuits of the shop, and then nodded with what appeared to be satisfaction. He announced that the boots were acceptable, paid the exact amount without comment or tip, and instructed Vogel to have them delivered to his office at Prague Castle that afternoon, along with a tin of the recommended leather treatment. Then, without another word, Dietrich walked out of the shop, his bodyguards falling into formation around him, and climbed back into his staff car. Vogel watched through the window as the vehicle pulled away, carrying in its back seat a Nazi Oberfuhrer, wearing boots with hollow heels that contained secrets potentially worth more than 1,000 lives. The wave of relief that washed over Vogel after Dietrich's departure was so intense it was nearly incapacitating. His legs weakened, and he had to sit down before they gave out completely, his hands shaking with released tension that he had suppressed for the entire interaction. He had done it. Against all probability, against every instinct that screamed the operation was too dangerous, he had successfully modified the boots of one of the highest-ranking SS officers in Prague and sent him on his way to Berlin carrying intelligence that could change the trajectory of Allied code-breaking efforts. But the relief was short-lived, quickly replaced by the understanding that he had now pushed his luck as far as it could possibly stretch. The Gestapo investigation had never truly ended, only paused, and every successful operation increased the statistical probability that patterns would emerge, that coincidences would accumulate beyond the threshold of chance. Vogel had 7 days until his scheduled extraction, 7 days during which he would have to maintain absolute normalcy, while knowing that Dietrich would soon be in Berlin, walking through the corridors of Nazi power, with secrets literally under his feet. The 7 days between Dietrich's departure and the scheduled extraction became a masterclass in psychological endurance, as Vogel continued operating his shop with robotic precision, while his mind counted down every hour toward either escape or capture. He maintained his normal schedule, accepting new repair jobs, completing routine work, engaging in the same banal conversations with customers that had defined his cover for nearly 2 years. But everything felt different now. Every interaction tinged with the awareness that this could be his last day of freedom, every Nazi officer who walked through his door a potential executor of his death sentence. The resistance had instructed him to show absolutely no deviation from normal behavior, to avoid any action that might trigger surveillance alerts, so he forced himself into a performance of ordinariness that required more courage than any of the espionage work itself. On the 3rd day after Dietrich's pickup, Vogel received word through coded messages, hidden in a newspaper delivery, that the Oberfuhrer had arrived safely in Berlin and was already at work in his new position, completely unaware that he was walking on intelligence gold that would soon find its way into Allied hands. The extraction plan began to crystallize through a series of carefully orchestrated signals that appeared random to outside observers but carried precise meaning to Vogel. A customer who came to pick up repaired shoes mentioned in passing that the weather forecast called for rain the following Wednesday, which told Vogel that the extraction would occur on schedule. A delivery of new leather arrived with an invoice that had a small pencil mark in the corner, confirming that the route south was still viable and the contacts in Hungary remained operational. These fragments of information provided some comfort, but Vogel knew that extraction operations failed as often as they succeeded, usually ending with everyone involved either dead or in Gestapo custody. He began the delicate process of putting his affairs in order, without appearing to do so, burning certain personal documents in his fireplace while keeping others visible, setting aside a small bag of essentials hidden beneath a floorboard, preparing himself mentally for the moment when he would walk away from everything he had ever known. On the 6th day, Vogel's carefully maintained composure nearly shattered when Ernst Kaufmann returned to the shop unannounced, the same Gestapo officer whose initial visit months earlier had first signaled that the investigation was closing in. Kaufmann carried a pair of boots that he claimed needed resoling, but his eyes roamed the shop with predatory awareness, taking inventory of everything, clearly searching for something, though Vogel could not determine what. The conversation that followed was a verbal chess match where every word carried multiple meanings. Kaufmann asking seemingly innocent questions about Vogel's business volume, his most notable customers, whether he had noticed any unusual activity in the neighborhood. Vogel answered with the same humble deference he had perfected, providing information that was technically true, but carefully incomplete, maintaining the persona of a simple tradesman with nothing to hide. But he could feel Kaufmann probing, testing, looking for inconsistencies or nervous tells that might justify whatever suspicions had brought him back. The visit lasted nearly 30 minutes before Kaufmann finally left, and Vogel spent the rest of that day in a state of elevated terror, wondering if the Gestapo had uncovered something or if this was simply another round of intimidation designed to provoke a panicked reaction. The 7th and final day arrived with agonizing slowness, each hour dragging by as Vogel waited for either the extraction or the arrest that would end his journey. He had decided that morning to close the shop early, claiming a sudden illness, the agreed-upon signal that would activate the final phase of the extraction plan. At noon, he locked the front door, placed a handwritten sign explaining his absence, and retreated to his living quarters above the shop to wait for midnight. The afternoon and evening hours were torture, his mind cycling through every possible disaster scenario, while his ears strained for the sound of Gestapo boots on the stairs. He packed and repacked his small bag of essentials, trying to decide what pieces of his life were worth carrying and what could be abandoned. Photographs of his deceased parents, a few letters, a small amount of currency, identity papers that would probably be useless but might provide some temporary cover. Everything else, the shop, the tools, the reputation built over decades, would be left behind as if it had never mattered at all. At 11:45 that night, Vogel heard the rumble of a truck engine approaching through the narrow streets, and his entire body tensed with the understanding that the moment of commitment had finally arrived. He moved to his window and saw in the dim moonlight a battered delivery truck pulling to a stop in the alley behind his building, exactly as promised. Two figures emerged from the cab, and one of them gave a low whistle, the signal that meant the extraction was proceeding as planned. Vogel grabbed his bag, took one final look around the rooms that had been his entire world, and descended the back stairs into the alley. The resistance operatives greeted him with quiet efficiency, hustling him into the back of the truck, where he found himself wedged between crates of what appeared to be machine parts. As the truck pulled away from his shop for the last time, Vogel allowed himself a single moment of grief for everything he was losing, and then forced his mind forward toward whatever uncertain future awaited him beyond the borders of occupied Prague, assuming he lived long enough to reach it. Henrik Vogel never made it to Hungary. The truck carrying him south was stopped at a checkpoint just outside the town of Tábor, approximately 90 kilometers from Prague, where a routine inspection by Wehrmacht soldiers turned catastrophic when one of the resistance operatives made the fatal mistake of reaching for a concealed weapon. The ensuing firefight killed both operatives and left Vogel wounded in the leg, captured alive and transported back to Prague for interrogation at Czech Palace, the notorious Gestapo headquarters, where screams echoed through stone corridors designed to contain them. But here is where Henrik Vogel's story transforms from espionage thriller into something far more profound about human resilience under impossible conditions. Despite 5 weeks of interrogation that included techniques so brutal they cannot be described in detail, Vogel never revealed a single name from the resistance network. He admitted to modifying boots, claimed he had been coerced by unnamed partisans who threatened his mother, and maintained that fiction through every session of torture until his interrogators eventually concluded he was either telling the truth or possessed a will that could not be broken. In August of 1943, Henrik Vogel was executed by firing squad in a Prague courtyard, dying without ever knowing that the intelligence he had sent to Berlin in Oberfuhrer Dietrich's boots had already reached Allied codebreakers and was contributing to the systematic breaking of Nazi communications that would help shorten the war by months, saving countless thousands of lives. The true impact of Vogel's operation remained classified for decades after the war ended, buried in intelligence archives that slowly revealed the extent of his contribution only when documents were declassified in the 1990s. What emerged was a staggering reality. Between August of 1942 and his capture in June of 1943, Henrik Vogel had successfully modified and delivered 47 pairs of boots containing microfilmed intelligence that reached Allied networks across Europe. The cumulative value of that information included early warnings about deportation schedules that allowed some Jewish families to go into hiding, tactical intelligence about Wehrmacht supply lines that informed Allied bombing priorities, and most significantly, the communications security documentation that accelerated the breaking of German military codes. Intelligence historians now estimate that Vogel's network was responsible for information that directly or indirectly influenced dozens of Allied operational decisions, making him one of the most productive unsung operatives of the entire war. Yet his name appears in no monuments, no history books taught in schools, no popular accounts of World War II heroism, because the nature of his work was too mundane, too strange, too far removed from the conventional narratives of resistance fighters with guns and explosives. What haunts me most about Henrik Vogel's story is the profound loneliness of his sacrifice. He operated without recognition, without the camaraderie that sustains soldiers in combat units, without even the cold comfort of knowing his work mattered because he died before the fruits of his espionage could be measured. Every night he carved hollow chambers into boot heels. He did so with the knowledge that discovery meant torture and death, yet he continued anyway, driven by something deeper than courage and more complex than patriotism. It was a choice to matter in a world that had declared people like him irrelevant, to fight back against an evil so enormous that individual resistance seemed absurd, to assert through his skilled hands that even a conquered cobbler could sabotage an empire. The banality of his method, the utter ordinariness of boots and leather and careful craftsmanship, makes his heroism somehow more remarkable than the dramatic acts we typically celebrate, because it required him to transform the mundane into the extraordinary through nothing more than will and meticulous attention to detail. This raises a question that transcends historical curiosity and touches something fundamental about how we understand courage and resistance. How many Henrik Vogels existed during that war? People whose contributions were so subtle, so embedded in the ordinary fabric of daily life, that history never recorded their names. How many secretaries typed documents a certain way? How many janitors left doors unlocked? How many accountants misplaced decimals in logistics reports? Each small act of sabotage, invisible individually, but cumulative in effect. Vogel's story suggests that resistance was far more pervasive than we typically acknowledge, that occupied populations fought back in thousands of tiny ways that never made it into the historical record because they looked like nothing at all. It challenges our Hollywood understanding of heroism as something loud and obvious, replacing it with a more unsettling truth. That the most effective resistance might be the kind that looks exactly like compliance until the moment its impact becomes undeniable. What would you have done in Henrik Vogel's position, knowing that every boot you modified brought you closer to discovery and death? Could you have maintained that double life, smiling at your executioners while carving their defeat into the heels of their footwear? Henrik Vogel died believing he had failed because he was captured before reaching safety, never knowing that his failure was actually one of the war's quiet triumphs. That tragic irony defines his legacy and should define how we remember the countless invisible warriors who fought tyranny through small acts of defiance that seemed meaningless at the time. This story matters today not because it adds another heroic name to the pantheon of World War II legends, but because it reminds us that resistance to evil does not require extraordinary circumstances or superhuman abilities. It requires only the decision to use whatever skills you possess, whatever access you have, whatever small corner of the world you occupy, to make the choice that history will judge as right, even if you never live to see that judgment rendered. Henrik Vogel was a cobbler who became a saboteur, and in doing so he proved that no position is too humble, no contribution too small, and no individual too ordinary to change the trajectory of history. That lesson, hard-won in the hollow heels of Nazi boots, remains as vital today as it was in the darkness of 1943 Prague.